first nail snapped in half from the cold. The second skated off the plank and cut her thumb. By the time Mary Fletcher got the third one to stick, her hands were shaking so bad she nearly drove it through her palm. The wind howled through the cottonwoods like wolves starving in a cage. A dozen men from town had stopped by the edge of her property that morning to watch her climb that ladder with a bundle of split shingles under her arm. They laughed when she hammered down a beam atop the existing roof, shaking their heads like she'd gone mad. But they weren't there the night the first roof cracked. They hadn't heard the way the timbers groaned like old bones, and they didn't know what it meant to cradle a baby wrapped in nothing but rags, while the walls around you sucked in the storm like a lung full of death. She didn't have time to explain it to them, and if they wouldn't listen before, she wasn't about to beg now. The wind caught the edge of her shawl and nearly pulled her backward off the rafters. She threw her weight forward and flattened her chest against the beam, her knees straddling the ridge like a child riding a fence post. Below her, the small square cabin huddled in the clearing like a guilty secret, just 30 paces from the tree line. The second roof she was building was narrow, just enough pitch to guide away snow, but not enough to let wind whip under. It wasn't meant for the sky. It was meant for the cold, the kind that came up from beneath, seeped through chinks, rode inside every gust, and it was coming again. The first warning sign had been the stillness. The woods always went silent when the big storms neared. No birds, no rabbits, not even the rustle of pine needles. The dogs up the valley had started barking that morning and hadn't stopped. Now, as Mary drove the last shingle into place above the sleeping loft, her ears rang from windburn, and the horizon to the west had turned a sickly shade of grey. She had maybe 3 hours. Inside the cabin, her newborn stirred in the cradle, if you could call it that. It was a wicker basket tucked into a hollowed bench beside the stove, lined with straw and wrapped in the warmest flannel she'd managed to trade for in November. His name was Samuel, and he was 9 weeks early. The midwife had told her he wouldn't last a week without a fire going day and night, but Mary hadn't had enough wood since late December. She was burning fence posts now, burning what she couldn't eat. There was nothing left but the roof beams, and the baby, well, he wasn't something she could replace. When her husband, Will, had gone missing during the cattle drive last spring, Mary had waited 2 months before accepting what the others had whispered all along. He wasn't coming back. He hadn't even known she was pregnant when he left. Their last night together had ended in silence, anger, and a slammed door. No goodbyes, no kind words, just cold planks, an empty bed, and a season of regret stretching ahead like a road without wagons. Now the men who used to shake Will's hand at Sunday service couldn't bring themselves to look her in the eye, and when they did, it was pity mixed with something crueler. Mockery, the kind of smirking judgment that comes from men who believe a woman can't swing an axe, can't plan a chimney draft, can't climb a roof without falling. She didn't care what they thought. She only cared if her son could breathe come nightfall. She climbed down the ladder with a final jerk of her frozen limbs, landing in the drift below with a grunt. Her boots cracked through the top layer and hit mud. The warmth of the earth still lingered beneath the snow. Barely. That's why she'd added the second roof. It wasn't just about the top. She was sealing the whole thing like a bottle, stale air and all, trapping every bit of warmth she could inside. Not just overhead, but on the side too. The roof overhang she'd built extended downward at an angle, meeting half-height walls she'd been stacking with packed mud and straw since October. It looked ridiculous, like a child's drawing of a house drawn twice, one on top of the other. But it was what she had, and it had to be enough. By the time she stepped back inside, her knuckles were purple, and her breath came in broken clouds. She latched the door shut with a timber beam, and shoved a wool sack into the last visible gap under the sill. The cabin's single room was dim, even with the midday sun outside. A faint golden glow came from the stove's mouth, where a single log hissed and whispered like a dying snake. Samuel stirred again, his tiny fists poking through the flannel. She knelt beside him and touched his cheek. Cold, not ice cold, not yet, but not warm either. She swallowed the lump in her throat and leaned closer, pressing her forehead to his, and breathing deep, trying to warm his skin with hers. The wind hit the roof above like a battering ram. She flinched, but the new beams held. So far, the first time the roof had failed, it had happened in the middle of the night. The center joist had bowed inward, and snow had poured through the attic trapdoor like flour through a sieve. She'd woken to Samuel coughing, choking on the sudden burst of cold air, and spent 3 hours fighting to keep the draft away from his basket. That was when she decided she'd build a second roof, even if it killed her. She thought back to the town's reaction when she'd bartered for extra nails and timber at the general store. Old Caleb had nearly spat his coffee when she described her plan. "A roof on top of a roof," he'd snorted. "What, you gonna stack a second outhouse too. Maybe build another floor while you're at it." The laughter that followed had felt like daggers behind her back. Not a single man offered help. Not one neighbor offered so much as a tarp. They didn't say it to her face, but she could hear it clear. Crazy widows, losing her mind. But tonight, when the storm hit, when the snow climbed up windows, and the wind screamed through the valley like a banshee dragging chains, she would not lose her baby. She would not. The wind shifted direction, pressing against the cabin from the north now. The logs creaked, the rafters shuddered, but the second roof above bore the brunt, and the room below stayed still, quiet almost. Mary stood and gathered every scrap of cloth in the house, old shirts, towels, the half-frozen laundry she hadn't managed to dry, and stuffed them into wall gaps. She poured the last of the bear fat into the lantern and lit it, placing it near the cradle. It gave off a warmth barely felt, but the light kept the shadows at bay. Outside, the snow began to fall, not flakes, chunks, wet, heavy, smothering snow, the kind that bends trees and buries barns, the kind that kills. The fire sputtered once, then again. The last log was halfway gone. Mary took a breath, moved to the wall, and reached for the pry bar. There was one beam left in the corner, an old support from the original shed Will had built. She'd kept it as a shelf. Now it would burn. She worked it loose with her teeth gritted, and when it finally came free with a splintering crack, the sound echoed through the house like thunder. She fed it to the stove. The baby stirred, then whimpered, then cried. Mary dropped to her knees beside him and lifted him gently from the basket, pressing him against her chest. Her heart beat louder than the wind. His breath was shallow but steady. She rocked him there, whispering nothing, just breath, just warmth. The walls around them groaned, but held. The second roof didn't give, not yet. And outside, somewhere in the dark woods, a wolf howled, long and low. But Mary didn't move. She was counting heartbeats now. 1, 2, 3. The log snapped, casting sparks, and the snow kept falling. She didn't sleep that night, not even once. Every hour, Mary Fletcher would sit perfectly still and listen to the storm, to the rafters, to the tiny, wet rasp of her son's breath. The fire burned low, too low. The beam she'd fed it was gone by dawn, and the orange glow had dulled to a yawning eye of ash. But the second roof above hadn't buckled, hadn't cracked, hadn't whined once under the weight, and that meant something more than wood or nails. It meant time. It meant another chance. When morning finally broke, it didn't come with light. The windows glowed faintly, like parchment over a candle, but the real world beyond them was sealed shut, every pane rimmed thick with frost, the corners black with creeping ice. She pushed her knuckles to the glass and felt nothing but cold. Then the silence hit. Storms like that don't just fade, they stop, like a scream swallowed too fast. There was no more howling, no more rattling snow on the roof, no groan of trees whipping against each other, just silence, still as a graveyard in fog. Mary held Samuel closer. His face was red from crying, but his cheeks hadn't turned grey, and that alone was victory. His little ribs still moved, not fast, not frantic, just enough. She bundled him tighter, wrapping both her shawls around him and tucking her own sleeves inside the wrap. Her own skin was mottled and raw beneath the wrists, her fingertips cut and pale from firewood and frost. She winced each time she closed her hands, but there was no room for pain today. The fire needed wood. That was the only thing that mattered, and there was none. Unless she stepped outside, unless she did something stupid. She sat in the silence for another hour, hoping a miracle would appear, an ember flaring back to life, a stray piece of kindling she'd missed, but nothing surfaced. The cabin was clean, too clean, like it had been picked over by wolves already. Mary stared at the old door. She could still hear Will's voice in her memory. "You stay inside till the second day. Storm's not done till it's quiet twice." But Will wasn't here, and Samuel was. That changed everything. She wrapped him again, this time in 3 layers, pressing his little body tight against her stomach under the coat. Then she packed one of the socks full of cloth scraps and tucked it in the cradle in his place, a trick the midwife once taught her to preserve body warmth when stepping away. The baby would come with her. She wasn't risking that cradle getting cold. With her left hand, she tightened the belt around her coat. With the right, she gripped the axe. Dull now, chipped at the edges, but still heavy, still enough to split boards if needed. She opened the door slowly. The outside world didn't rush in. It waited. The snow was taller than the porch beams, a wall of it, packed, wet, breathing its own slow breath. She couldn't see the woods, couldn't even see the clearing, just whiteness, soft and absolute. A few steps out, and the cabin would vanish behind her like a memory. Mary didn't hesitate. She slammed the axe down at the edge of the doorway, carving a small path. 1 foot forward, then another. She cut a narrow trench like a rabbit trail, no more than shoulder-width wide, moving around the cabin to the back, where the old lean-to had collapsed 2 years earlier. But where, just maybe, some of the warped floor beams had survived under the snow. Each strike was slower than the last. The snow was sticky and wet, not powdery, weighing her down with every scoop. She panted, chest heaving, her own sweat freezing in the hollows of her shirt. But she didn't stop. For Samuel, that chant beat with each footstep now. For Samuel. When she finally reached the back wall, her body trembled so badly she could barely stand upright. She knelt and began to dig with both hands, pushing aside armfuls of snow, fingers going numb almost instantly. After 15 minutes, her wrist struck something hard. Wood, cracked planks, dry. She grabbed the axe again and pried the beam loose. It broke in two, but both halves were usable. She shoved them under her arm and turned back to the path. The trench was already filling behind her. The snow swallowed her footprints like water. By the time she made it back to the cabin and slammed the door shut behind her, she was shaking so hard her knees gave out, and she fell backward against the threshold. The beams clutched tight in her arms. Samuel whimpered under the coat. Alive, she laughed. It came out like a sob, sharp and brief. She tossed the wood into the stove and blew on the last embers until her throat ached. Smoke rose, flames followed. The cabin warmed, slightly. She took a strip of dried jerky from the shelf and bit off half, chewing it soft before pressing the mashed part between Samuel's lips. He didn't suck it, but he didn't cry either. His lips were pink, not purple. His eyes blinked, slow, heavy. The rest of the day blurred. The light outside never returned. The snow still whispered against the windows like a tide, but it didn't press as hard now. The second roof held, not a single drip from above, and the packed walls she'd built, the strange little triangle where roof met ground, those stayed firm too. The entire cabin felt smaller now, more like a cave than a home, but warm, and that warmth was everything. As the day wore on, Mary sat beside the cradle and let her thoughts wander. She thought of Will's voice again, how he used to hum low when mending saddle straps, how he'd squint when splitting logs, always measuring twice but still missing the mark. She thought of the first time she held Samuel and the way he hadn't cried for almost a full minute, and how the midwife had slapped his back so hard Mary nearly punched her in the face. She thought of the neighbors, the ones who laughed. She pictured their homes now, scattered across the valley, the wind whistling through their thin walls, the gaps in their lofts, the ice creeping in around their stovepipes. How many of them had second roofs? How many had planned for this? Probably none. The image gave her no comfort. She didn't want them to suffer, but she didn't need their approval anymore. She never had. The light dimmed again. Night was coming. She fed the second beam into the fire and wrapped herself tighter around Samuel. No more food, no more wood. Tomorrow, she'd need to make a real choice. If the snow cleared, she'd walk to town. It would take half a day in good weather, but that was only if the cold didn't catch her halfway down the ridge. She closed her eyes, breathing shallow. Sleep stole her then, not deep, not safe, but enough. And in the middle of the night, she woke, because someone was knocking, not loud, just steady. 3 slow knocks. She froze. No one knocked out here, not unless something was wrong. Samuel stirred. She hushed him with her palm, rising slowly and grabbing the axe again. Another knock. She crossed the cabin and pressed her ear to the door. Wind and silence. Then a voice. "Mary, you in there?" She blinked. It was Caleb, from town. She flung the door open, blinking at the light of his lantern. Snow burst in around him as he stumbled inside, followed by 2 others, Sam Doyle and Hank Lutter. All 3 were half covered in frost, cheeks raw, gloves stiff with ice. "We came," Caleb wheezed, dropping his pack. "We came to check." He looked around the cabin, blinking at the tight second roof overhead, the sealed walls, the stove still glowing. "You're warm," he muttered. "How the hell?" Mary didn't say anything. Hank pulled his gloves off and rubbed his hands near the fire, staring in disbelief. We got 10 houses collapsed," he said. "Roofs caved in. The Perkins boys got frostbite bad. Doc says he might lose the foot." Caleb shook his head, still staring at the cabin's strange angles. "You were right," he said softly. "That second roof, God almighty, it saved this place." Samuel whimpered. They all turned. Caleb stepped back. "You brought the baby through this?" Mary only nodded, holding him tighter. Then Hank said the quiet part. "We got women down the ridge with no heat left, no wood. Some with kids, too. Couldn't get the fires started again. Stovepipes cracked. They're sleeping under quilts on dirt floors now." Mary stared at him. He looked up. "Could we bring 'em here?" There was silence. The fire popped. Mary looked down at Samuel, his chest rising, still alive. She nodded once, then turned back toward the cradle and began making room. They arrived before first light. 5 of them at first, then 9. By mid-morning there were 13 souls huddled inside Mary Fletcher's one-room cabin. 3 women, 7 children, 2 half-frozen men from the lower flats, and an old widow who hadn't spoken a word since she'd been carried in. The blizzard had snapped the roofs clean off some cabins, had shattered stovepipes, had pressed so hard against some doors that they couldn't be opened until neighbors dug people out by hand. But here, inside Mary's oddly shaped home, beneath the strange second roof and packed earth outer shell, it was warm enough to breathe, to speak, to feed a baby, and not watch him go blue in the lips. They didn't laugh when they stepped in. They didn't speak much at all. One woman, Elise Perot, fell to her knees the moment she crossed the threshold. Her face was raw from frost, and both her hands had gone stiff from trying to heat bricks in a broken hearth all night. She hadn't been able to save the soup or the blankets. Her youngest, Thomas, was just 3 and hadn't stopped shaking for 16 hours. When she saw the fire still burning in Mary's stove, meager, yes, but real, she burst into tears. Mary didn't have the heart to ask questions. She simply pointed to the floor, to the straw-lined side bench, to the square of cloth she'd spread near the chimney vent. People filled every inch, some curled in corners, others sat upright, blank-faced, holding on to whatever rags they'd carried with them. The children were mostly silent. That was the worst part. By midday, Samuel stirred again. The others stared when they heard him cry, not because they were annoyed, but because it meant something survived. It meant something could still live through this. That was more than most had dared to believe when night fell last. Caleb returned with another bundle of wood he'd scavenged from a collapsed tool shed down the ridge. Each log was soaked half through, but it was something. He dropped the bundle beside the fire and rubbed his beard, glancing around the tight interior. The second roof hung lower than most ceilings, just high enough to walk under if you ducked, but it held the heat in like a kettle lid. He turned to Mary. "I think you saved a town, Mary." She didn't reply. There was no room for praise right now, only math. 13 mouths, plus Samuel, 1 stove, 2 logs left if the new bundle proved too wet to catch. No water unless snow was melted. No food but 3 sacks of beans, 1/4 pound of salt pork, and a sack of turnips that had already started going soft. Mary set to work without words. She directed the women to crush snow into pots. She cut the pork into slivers, so thin you could almost see through them. She mashed beans into a paste and stirred it with snow water to stretch it. The turnips she diced into quarters, then halves again, boiling the pieces to bring out what little sweetness they had left. The old widow who hadn't spoken began humming quietly as she rocked back and forth in the far corner. The others ignored it. Mary did not. She remembered that tune. It was something her mother had hummed during storms, something so old it didn't even have words. By sundown, the food was hot, barely, but the heat helped people talk, not laugh, not smile, but speak, and the stories came out. The Miller cabin had collapsed just after nightfall. 2 children buried under loft boards, 1 lost. The Doyles had burned their last log and slept under hay until the hay caught fire. Elisa's chimney cracked and collapsed, filling her parlor with ice and soot. Hank's place was buried above the windows, door jammed shut until he dug his way through the ceiling with a butcher knife. No one could remember a storm like it, not in their lives, not in their fathers' lives. Mary kept her focus tight. Stir, feed, check the baby, stoke the fire, stir, feed, check, stoke. When the fire flared bright from a fresh dried log catching at last, a few people gasped, not because they hadn't seen fire before, but because for a moment they could feel it. That was new. That was rare. Then came the knock, again, but not the same rhythm, not slow and cautious like before. This was urgent. Fists, slaps, boots hitting the doorframe. Mary stood quickly, Samuel cradled against her ribs. "Who is it?" she called. "Raymond!" a voice shouted. "From the North Ridge!" Another knock. "We got women! We got kids! Please, your cabin's the only one!" Caleb opened the door. The wind howled in, and 3 more figures stumbled inside. Raymond collapsed to his knees. He was blue to the lips, face cut, bleeding from the nose. A child was bundled in his arms. Mary couldn't tell if it was a boy or girl. Another woman followed, half frozen, dragging a bundle behind her. The child wasn't breathing. Mary acted before she thought. She took the limp body from Raymond, unwrapped it, pressed her hand to the little chest. No rise. She bent over the child and blew into her mouth, pressing on the chest, warming the tiny fingers with her own. No sound, no stir. Then, one twitch, another. The child's eyes opened, glazed, but open. The woman behind Raymond sobbed once and dropped to the floor. Mary handed the girl back. That night, they made more space. People slept on top of one another, on coats and sacks, on folded cloth and piles of straw. The second roof groaned under weight, but it held. Outside, the snow kept falling. Late in the night, someone tried to open the door from the outside again, but this time, No one got up. They were too tired. Or maybe they'd stopped believing help could keep coming. But Mary rose again. She always did. Two more figures stumbled in, a father and son. One coughing blood, the other half-starved. Mary didn't ask names anymore, only looked in their eyes. Did you survive? Can you still feel your fingers? Will you make it to dawn? If the answer wasn't no, she fed them. If it was, she sat beside them until they slept, or didn't. On the third morning, the fire ran out, completely. No more logs, no more splinters, no more support beams left to pry loose. People began to shiver again. Some suggested they dig out and start walking, find a barn, a church, something bigger. But Mary knew, if they stepped out now, they wouldn't make it 50 yards. The snow had sealed the world. Their breath frosted mid-air. Eyes froze shut if you didn't blink enough. Children passed out before crying. The cabin was small, but it was sealed. The second roof had turned it into a lung that breathed with them, slow and wet and warm. Mary made the choice no one wanted to say out loud. She pried loose the last shelf, the beam beneath the loft, the crate lid she'd kept as a table for 3 years. Everything became firewood. She told herself it was temporary, just until the storm passed, just until the snow let up and the sun cracked the edge of the ridge again. But deep down, she knew, even if the skies cleared tomorrow, it would take 2 more days to dig out the valley, to reach town, to start anything. She fed the stove piece by piece, every hour. The baby was still warm. People took turns fanning the fire. Others took turns melting snow. Then came the question, from Caleb. "How'd you think of it?" Yitzhak asked her one night as he sat beside the stove, eyes fixed on the strange pitch of the inner ceiling. "The second roof," he continued. "No one thought it'd hold. Most figured you'd built something to climb on, try and hang yourself or some such madness." Mary didn't look up. She was too tired. Her hands were bleeding from where she'd burned them, fanning too close. "I didn't think," she said. "You had to," he insisted. "This ain't luck. You planned it. You made it airtight. You even pitched it right. Wind didn't catch a seam. What made you do it?" Mary touched her son's head. "I couldn't afford to be wrong. That was all. And that was enough." He looked at her then, eyes soft. "You saved more than just yourself, Mary. You know that?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat was too tight. At dawn, the snow stopped. The air outside hissed, slow and heavy, like a drunk man trying to breathe through a cracked nose. The silence that followed was immense, deep, still. People stirred, blinked, stood slowly. Caleb cracked the top hatch. Light spilled in, blinding, cold, but blue and real. Mary stepped up with him. What she saw made her gasp. The whole valley was buried. Houses were half gone, trees broken, barns collapsed. The only structure still standing as far as the eye could see was her cabin, with its strange double roof, its low-slung walls and earth-packed seams. It looked like nothing, like a lopsided barn built by a half-blind mule, but it had held, and everyone else was alive because of it. When they descended again, the old widow spoke for the first time. She looked Mary in the eye and said, "You don't know what you just did, but someday, someone's gonna tell it." Then she turned and curled up against the wall, and that was all. Mary held Samuel and looked around the room. So many faces, so many breaths in the cold, all watching her now, not with pity, but with something else, something like reverence. She didn't want it, but she accepted it, because if she didn't, what had any of this been for? The digging began that same afternoon, not because they wanted to leave. No one spoke of leaving, not really, but because they had to. The food was nearly gone. The firewood was now reduced to broken stools, spoon handles, a shutter Mary had once carved initials into. Even the shelves under the loft were bare. The fire needed something, and the people, too. They needed movement, action, a reason to stay upright. So they took turns at the hatch, clearing snow in shifts with what tools remained: soup ladles, a fry pan, one dented shovel that Elise had found in her pack under the straw. It was like digging through wet flour. The snow had weight, memory. It closed over itself when they turned their backs, like it meant to bury them again if they weren't quick. Mary didn't join the digging at first. She sat on the bench with Samuel, now sleeping deeper, longer, more peacefully. The color had returned to his lips. His breath was soft but steady. The neighbors who'd once scoffed at her work now came to check on him quietly, reverently. No one questioned her anymore. No one asked why she'd built a second roof or what kind of mother she thought she was to raise a child alone out here. Those questions had vanished in the storm. What remained was something different, a kind of hush, not of shame, but of recognition. Still, Mary couldn't rest, not fully, not yet. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the edge of that storm again, the shape it took in her memory, like a great mouth swallowing the sky. Every time she drifted, she remembered the sound of her roof beams cracking weeks before, and the way the cold had crept across the cradle's rim like a ghost's fingers. So instead of sleeping, she planned, not escape, survival. If the snow didn't give way enough to let them hike out in 2 days, They'd have to make heat from something else. Maybe dig down to the root cellar of the abandoned Clark homestead if it hadn't flooded. Maybe burn the pine roots if they could reach them. Resin caught fire easy if you split it thin. Or maybe the knock returned. But this time, it wasn't frantic. It was slow, measured, heavy, 3 times, then silence. Caleb stood from his place near the stove and approached. He looked to Mary, who only nodded. He opened the door. A man stood there, bareheaded, bearded, wrapped in a patchwork coat that had once been fine but was now torn to ribbons. His eyes were sunken, his boots crusted in snow up to the laces. But his voice was calm when he spoke. "Mary Fletcher." Mary stood slowly, her heart crawling up her throat. "Yes," the man nodded, like he'd expected it. "I was sent to find you." He pulled back the flap of his coat, revealing a sheriff's badge. Not polished, not proud, just there. "From Winton's Ridge, 3 days north. Folks there said they lost your husband during the spring drive. Said he was headed east before he disappeared." Mary stepped forward, gripping Samuel tighter. "Why are you here?" she asked. The man took something from his pocket, a letter, yellowed, folded, brittle with moisture. "He wrote this," the man said. "Didn't get to send it." Mary took the paper with one shaking hand. The sheriff didn't wait for her to open it. He simply said, "He didn't die in the stampede like they said. Made it to a town called Grey Bend. Took ill there. Some lung rot they couldn't fix. Lasted a few days. Asked for someone to bring this if they passed near Hollow Ridge." He looked past her, into the cabin. "Didn't expect to find you with half the county in your house." Mary didn't reply. The sheriff adjusted his coat, stepping backward. "You did something mighty here, ma'am. Whole town's talking. Said the Perkins boys survived frostbite because of you. Said your fire lit half the valley." Then he turned and left. Just like that. Mary stood there with the letter in her hand. She didn't open it right away. She knew what it would say. Will's handwriting had always been clumsy, like he was trying to say more than his hands could carry. It would be short, simple, probably an apology wrapped in too much silence. That was his way. She placed the letter on the mantel and sat down. Her hands shook, not from cold, from the storm that was finally over. Caleb came to her side. "You okay?" She nodded. Then, after a pause, "I think I need to rest." He smiled faintly. "You've earned it, I'd say." That night, the fire burned low again, but no one panicked. The snow outside began to harden, not fall, but crust over, like ice sealing a pond. And that was the sign they'd all been waiting for. The storm had broken. At dawn, they would leave. But that didn't mean Mary's cabin would be empty. Elise spoke first. "I'm stayin'." People turned. She raised her chin. "Ain't got much to go back to. Chimney's gone. Roof's half sunk. If Mary'll have me, I'll help her fix what's left." Caleb nodded. "I'll help dig you out. Bring back what's salvageable." Others agreed. The town would rebuild, but differently now. There was talk of second roofs, talk of sealing the walls, talk of packing mud before first snow next time. Mary listened to them all with quiet eyes. When she finally spoke, it was only to say, this place wasn't meant to be right, just warm. And it was. For the first time in weeks, Samuel slept through the night. The neighbors who once mocked her began sketching the shape of her roof in their ledgers, asking about pitch angles and overhangs. They offered nails, wood, tarps, trade. And Mary, though tired, though grieving, though holding a letter she hadn't yet dared open, felt something shift inside her. Not pride, not relief, something deeper. A peace that came from knowing she had not failed her child, not when it mattered most. The snow outside still reached the window's edge, but it didn't scare her now. She had beaten it, not with strength, but with will. And a roof no man had believed in. The dig-out took 3 more days, not because the snow was stubborn, though it was, packed hard as stone in some spots, but because none of them wanted to leave the cabin all at once. It had become something more than shelter. The low roof and packed walls, the lopsided shape, the narrow room where too many people slept too close and whispered too softly. It had become sacred, the kind of place you don't speak about loudly later on, because the memory bruises if handled wrong. It had been a cradle, a final chance, a last warmth in a season that would be remembered not by what it took, but by what somehow lived. By the end of the first week, the path to town had been cleared, just a winding trench of packed snow and ice that bent and curved between collapsed sheds and drift-buried fences. The town looked nothing like it had before. Roofs were gone, chimneys broken. One wagon had frozen mid-wheel beside the general store, its spokes bent from wind pressure. The mule that pulled it buried in snow so deep only its ears still poked out before they'd been dug free and laid to rest. But no one had frozen in their beds. Not a single child had died. And that wasn't chance. That was Mary Fletcher's roof. The mayor came by the following Sunday. He didn't knock, just stood at the path's end, hat in hand. He asked if she might draw up a diagram for how she'd packed the outer wall seams, said he'd like to suggest it for all cabins built going forward. He stammered when she looked at him, said he was sorry, that no one had listened, that maybe things would have gone different if they had. Mary didn't give him the satisfaction of saying it was all right, because it hadn't been, not for weeks. She simply handed him a small scrap of paper with a rough sketch and turned back toward the stove. Caleb stayed behind to help her rebuild the things she'd burned: beams, shelves, the roofline above the rear window. The others, too, returned as they could, bringing cloth, nails, firewood, salt, not because she asked, she never asked, but because they owed her, because she'd made a kind of space they hadn't believed could exist, a shelter not just of logs and tar, but of belief, of something stronger than weather. Samuel grew stronger each day. His cry returned, then faded into coos and soft sounds. His cheeks rounded. He stopped coughing in his sleep. And one morning, while the frost still clung to the window rims and the sky hadn't decided if it wanted to be spring yet, Mary finally opened the letter. She did it alone, by the fire, while Samuel slept. The paper crackled, dry and thin, as she unfolded it with slow fingers. Will's handwriting was there, slanted, broken in places, as if written between coughs. It wasn't long, and he hadn't known much, but he'd known one thing. Mary, if you're reading this, I didn't make it. I don't know how to say goodbye, so I won't. And I'm sorry I left the way I did. I was afraid of the cattle, the road, of what you'd become if I held you back. But I never stopped thinking of you. If the child came, tell them I was trying. Tell them you were the strongest thing I ever saw. Yours, Will. She folded it quietly and didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because the pain had already had its time. It had come on nights with no fire, on days with snow caked against the cradle, on the roof beam she'd pulled down with bleeding fingers because no one else would. She had earned this silence, and she would keep it. Weeks passed, the roads cleared, but Mary's cabin remained the center. People came to see it, not out of curiosity, but reverence. Elise started calling it the Stove House. Others called it the Widow's Keep. The names didn't matter. The warmth had. The children who had survived began to laugh again. They played in the muddy yard that once was buried past the doorframe, throwing slush and kicking down the last of the snowbanks. They drew shapes in the frost with warm hands and held Samuel like he was a symbol, not just a baby, like proof that something had lived through it all. A visiting preacher from Winton's Ridge stopped in come spring. He asked Mary if she wanted to share her testimony, to speak about what she'd endured, what she'd seen. She looked him in the eye and said only one thing: I built a second roof. He didn't press her. Later that summer, town meetings began with discussions of winter readiness, plans for double roofs, earth-packed walls, communal firewood stores. No one laughed, not anymore. Elise and Mary raised a small lean-to behind the cabin to hold tools and supplies. Caleb came by twice a week with lumber. They built new walls together, quietly. No need for chatter, no bragging. Mary planted a patch of potatoes that July. Samuel took his first steps before the frost came again, and when the first snow fell, early that year, too sharp for September, Mary stepped out onto the porch, her son on her hip, and looked at the sky. There was wind, cold, the smell of pine snap and storm breath, but she didn't flinch. She just looked up at the second roof, still standing, still strange, still hers, and behind her the fire glowed, and the house breathed warm.